Welcome to the Global Business Chat series. In these interviews, Wes is chatting about all things business to serious professionals from a variety of industries. Listen in to hear more about their challenges, opportunities, and the lessons they've learned along the way.
First of all, thank you very much for joining us on Global Business Chat.
That's okay.
Excited to have you on. Obviously, we've worked together for a little while now. Very interesting story. Could you tell us a bit about your background, please?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, well, pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invite, I suppose. I'd like any opportunity to get to chat about, property and me. We all love chatting about ourselves. No, but just to obviously a good chat about, what we have in common. Of course, we've had plenty of these chats before, but a bit of background, I suppose, for me, civil engineer, sort of through training and qualification. So when I went through university to become a civil engineer, became a civil engineer, sort of got a job in the city in London. I quite quickly realised that I wasn't really cut out for employment. I think I was probably one of the worst employees you could be because, I've got my own way of doing things and always suggesting, which I suppose can be a good thing. But I think for me, the main thing that kind of really was a big question mark was, putting in hours upon hours, grafting a lot as a graduate engineer to kind of prove myself, and then, not getting any overtime pay or any extra. And I'm sort of thinking, I'm earning okay, but there were sort of caps to that. So I sort of just tried to look for alternative things I could do that meant that I could have maybe a bit more time flexibility, a bit more freedom of choice of what I did with my time, with no ceiling of how much I could earn. And obviously, when you think about that, you think, okay, business, for one, ticks that box, and also after a little bit of research I realized property is the other. So I kind of combined the two really, and so now I've got a portfolio of properties. I have businesses within the property sector like yourself, I suppose, which obviously serve investors and people looking to learn how to do that, become property investors basically. So in 2010 I decided I would sort of step onto the property ladder. I got onto the property ladder. It was a good time to buy with the economy and everything at the time, because obviously we just come off the back of the big recession. It was still a uncertain time, of course, because obviously hindsight's wonderful. We can look back and be like, oh, what an amazing time to buy. But obviously right then and there in 2010, it's still up in the air. It's still kind of really volatile, and there's a lot of chat about double dips. But I was pretty certain that I wanted to get into it. So I bought a flat in London, did it up, made some money. Rest is history, I suppose. And 10 years later, we're doing pretty well.
You're doing really well. So over the past 10 years, what would you say is the biggest blooper there's been, biggest learning curve for you?
Blooper? Wow. Okay. Good questions. I mean, I could have done some prep, I suppose. That would have been good, wouldn't it?
Do you know what? It's good for it to be natural, really, because I bet there must be one at least, maybe even a couple, where you think, oh, yeah, do you know what? That actually springs to mind, and that was a really good learning, and you kind of changed maybe the model, the strategy of the business and the property development side of things as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's obviously been loads of learning curves, and I think in terms of the extent of them, you can also sort of, how do you grade them? Do you grade them on like losing money or time or whatever? I think some of the biggest ones for me is I've always been a person who likes to kind of learn by doing. So I'd rather sort of make my own mistake by doing it to learn through that process, rather than, maybe sort of learn from a book, if you know what I mean, and then be like, okay. So that's kind of the tact I took, certainly early on. And so, a lot of the mistakes I mainly made were on the refurb side of things, maybe putting in cheaper stuff than maybe I should have done, trying to scrimp and scrape, maybe pushing. I think one of the big ones for me as well is also kind of trying to push builders too much on their price.
Okay.
Because that's been a big learning curve, because obviously I didn't quite understand the power of having a good team and also paying that team what they're worth. And I think because certainly in the early stages of being a developer or an investor, you're sort of looking to save costs and cut costs where you can to maximize profit. But actually, by doing that, you actually sort of start turning people away in terms of, the people who are working for you and doing stuff, doing the build work or the carpentry work or whatever. You're always trying to drill them down on price. Then there's going to get to a point where they're going to snap and say, and they'll walk off or whatever. So in my early stages, I'd say there's been a few builders who I'd in hindsight would like to sort of turn the page and go back and say, look, I made a mistake, would you come back? Because actually you were pretty good. Because then I've gone on and used other trades who have been horrific, you know. So I think there's that side is definitely, there's been a few mistakes there in that respect. I think, you know, the other thing as well is trusting. So that process actually of the whole refurb and build side is actually a really sensitive process, because you've got to get the balance really right. And I think another big mistake, for example, I made was also trusting somebody too soon in that relationship. So, you know, paying monies up front. So, you know, there's one builder who's still running around with 11 grand of my money, and then you start, because I paid him up front, he promised to deliver and then he didn't, and he disappeared. So that was a big learning curve from a financial perspective, but also from just a general kind of process point of view. And you know, since then you sort of learn to, you know, no matter how great they sound, you learn that actually, no, you're the client and I'm in control of the money. You're going to do a job for me, so I will pay you what you're worth once you've done that job, and not feel like you have the temptation or pressure to pay anyone up front large amounts, because, you know, they might not be able to do the work for you for another 6 weeks. Like, I'd rather wait the 6 weeks and then do the process properly, if that makes sense.
No, it does make sense. And what I was thinking, actually, whilst you were talking then as well, I was listening, obviously, but just thinking, we have come across in the past where property owners and contractors, builders, have put in place a JCT. So JCT contract's been in place, and for whatever reason, it actually hasn't been set up correctly. So there's been elements within the JCT where it's been set up, and the property owner was actually, they were responsible for not only the property itself, but the build as well. And then when a claims arise, it's caused major issues in trying to get that resolved. So where I was going with this is, do you tend to use JCTs when you use builders? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I think one that's also really relevant. The answer is, I don't always use them, no. But there are occasions when I would use a contract like a JCT or an FMB, or the Federation of Master Builders, I think is the acronym there. Contract is, I generally will take a view on it on the actual contract value most of the time. So, for example, I've just done, and also it depends on the relationship of how you're dealing it and what sort of situation you're taking, or position that you're taking as the client. Are you taking the client role where you're then going to be contracting the entire job to a contractor who then manages all the subcontractors and stuff? And so there's that single kind of contract between the two. Or as what a lot of investors and developers certainly do early on, is they will do a lot of the management themselves and then employ the subcontractors directly, or just manage that kind of thing. So then you have lots of little contracts. And then you start getting into lots of little details and nuances if you do the different structures, like if you do it that way particularly. So you're not got a single, you've got lots of smaller values with lots of different subcontractors. So the argument might not be to have separate contracts at that point. So basically it depends, is the short answer to your sort of question. And usually I'll kind of look at it on like I said, on a contract value. So for me, anything sort of above, on a single contract of above sort of 15-20k, I might put a contract in place.
Okay.
Like that, where I'm using a single company or person to do all of that work and do the main contractor role. And certainly, obviously, bigger than that, I will definitely put a contract in place. Anything smaller than that, where I can kind of manage it myself, I might do an odd bit of work myself, going to site, or have just the subbies or the team now, because they've been working with me for years. They were actually kind of part of my team. I'll just sort of say, look, can you go in and do the electrics? Can you go and do the plumbing? Can you go in and do the carpentry work? And then I won't have contracts with them, but I know them already and the relationship's already there. So I think for anyone who's starting out, certainly I'd be looking at contract values of 10, maybe 15k plus, getting that contract, especially if it's one of your first few projects, because it's really important to go through that process. And what you will find going through that process is you'll find a number of tradesmen, or women, of course, who may kick back and be like, this is a bit over the top. But if they do, then they're not the right contractor to be using, is my approach. It just say, look, obviously, if it's one of your first few projects, it's a case, well, I'm still learning the process, we're going through it, I want to do it properly. And obviously, if you deliver and we do all fine, then on the next one, we can look at not using the contract or whatever and be a bit more flexible. But certainly early on, and if I look back at my first 2 or 3 projects, that's where coming back to your first question about the learning curve, I think had I had contracts, had I had more control over that element in terms of retaining the status quo of payments and keeping the cash back and not being influenced by the contractors to pay early or whatever, then I would have probably saved some money, but also I probably wouldn't have lost some money in certain areas or felt like the relationship then broke down because I'm paying for things I didn't think were worth it, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. And I think one of the things I'm hearing talking to you today is how important a team is. So we mentioned at the beginning, we've worked together for a number of years between ensuring the properties, contract developments, etc. But going in addition to that, so like architects, builders, subbies, if you'd like to call them subbies, so like subcontractors, like your electricians, plumbers, solicitor, I'd imagine. So you've got a strong team around you. And exactly, you have touched on it, but how important is it to have that team base that you build over a number of years to build your business, if you like, into property development, property, whichever element you go into around the team?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very important. But I think when you sort of break that team down and like who goes into that team, there are also a few critical players within that team who are more important to get right and have a strong relationship with than sort of others. So, for example, you've mentioned, obviously we've been working together for a number of years. You've been dealing with my portfolio, and you guys do a great job. And I'd highly recommend you to everyone, of course.
Thank you.
But the reason why is because so, for example, let's take your role as a prime example, right? As part of this team. So, could I go out and get cheaper rates and premiums with companies on all my individual properties elsewhere by going through the kind of the portals and the compare the markets and all those kind of things? The answer would be probably yes. But what I'd have to do to get that is I'd have to obviously then take ownership and management of all those individual elements. My time has also got a value. And then also, if anything then goes wrong, then I've got to deal with all that side of things. Whereas obviously having a good broker partner like yourself, you deal with all that side for me. So, okay, my premiums might be a little bit more and probably not an awful lot more, but I'm also getting that additional service whereby, you remind me every time something comes up. Obviously, we worked over the years to align all of our premiums so that they've got a single renewal date. So we're only doing it once a year rather than 10, 15 times a year. And so that also has a value. So having a strong player there is obviously holds a good value. Now, if you then look at your contractors, that's another key player. I'd say you want to get a good build team. And that's probably your most important player when it comes to any form of investment and development. Because as I teach people, and as most people may know, but if you don't know, one of the most important elements of being successful in property is to be able to add value to properties when you buy it. So you've got to buy it well. You've then got to add some form of value, which inherently will involve most of the time a refurb. And then you've created wealth, and then you can kind of go back in and either sell it or rent it or remortgage it, whatever. So that adding the value through refurb is then obviously an important phase. So having a good team around you that you can trust to deliver what you want, and also reasonably within price, of course, managing that budget is really important. So that's, I'd probably say, one of the most key players. I think you've then got like solicitors, you've mentioned, like too much of it. I've been through solicitors like hot dinners. It's really difficult to find a solicitor who's able to give you the personal service like you guys would give me in terms of the insurance side. Usually solicitor firms are quite big. You deal with junior people and junior staff, which is all fine, but then they turn over, they kind of move on, and obviously directors and the people who own the businesses aren't the people who you deal with on a day-to-day, because if you did deal with them on a day-to-day, their fees would be so high that it would then make it no sense. So solicitors are one of those ones which I'm like, because I get asked a lot, who's your solicitor? I was like, to be honest with you, I do kind of use a number of different firms for different type of things, and I have jumped around and moved. So that's less critical because solicitors know the conveyancing process. They know what needs to be done for kind of a vanilla conveyancing process. Now, obviously, if you've got specific legal requirements outside of that, litigation issues, whatever, that's where you then it comes a bit more important, but that's not till later on, if that makes sense. So yeah, so basically I think team is important, of course, and the other thing we as business owners and investors, a big word that we always want to remind ourselves of is leverage. So how can we leverage other people around us, leverage money, of course, as well, we think about, but how can we leverage the people around us to benefit from not only their skills, which is almost certainly always going to be better than ours, but also use their time to do the things that kind of helps to build your big, whatever you're building, this big thing. So because you can't do it all by yourself, the lone wolf the lone wolf will always take a longer time to get the results than it would do to have a team around you. So
no, definitely. Oh, thank you. So just thinking as well, I don't know how you found it, but certainly over the last 12 months during COVID, it's almost done like a 360-degree turn, if you like, with regards to offices and office space. So in the first lockdown, certainly in the insurance world, a lot of the insurers are thinking, everyone's working from home. Office space isn't going to be needed as much as it was before. Do we actually need an office anymore? And then certainly in the latest lockdown, you've seen a lot in the press with regards to possible mental health issues, isolation, people working from home that didn't necessarily have the kind of human interaction with their colleagues, not in real anyway, it was via Zoom, similar to this. But a lot of the insurers now are saying, for example, that actually they do need offices and it is important. Productivity has gone down as well in the last lockdown, or the third one, let's say. So that's the 360 that we're seeing, where actually offices are required, whereas at the beginning they weren't necessarily. What opportunities do you see in the property market now around that area?
I think it's a really interesting one. I think certainly I can relate to what you're saying in terms of, a lot of people obviously starting to work from. I mean, when I went full time into property and started working for myself, that was probably one of the hardest kind of phases of my life, which is because it takes a lot, it's a big skill to go from, because if you think about it, we've gone through school where we've had a timetable. We've got to turn up at this point, then we've got to leave at this point. We have a timetable of lessons, so we know where we've got to be when we've got to be. We then go to university. If we do go to university, college, same sorts of things. If you both go to higher education, then you get a job and you've got to turn up at 9, you've got to leave at 5, and you're generally told kind of what to do within that. And then all of a sudden, right, you're on your own. You've then got to sort of think of your own diary and what you're going to get up for the following day. It's a really, really hard thing to kind of get your head around. So I can totally see that. And so, I think when we first went into COVID, a lot of people were like, oh, this is great because, we can work from home, we're a bit more flexible. I think there's a lot of people who struggled, but the view, I think, like you said, 6 months ago was, okay, well, this might stay, but I agree that we have gone full circle. So I'm kind of in agreement with you in that respect. But I do think the way that it would, and obviously as a business owner, you might have your own view on this, certainly. But as business owners, I think they've also recognized that there was maybe a lot of fat that we could cut through through our processes, and in terms of overheads and stuff that can be cut down in the businesses. So using like Zoom and going more virtual, maybe going Flexiworking, those sorts of things will lean out a lot of the businesses so that they can increase their profit margins. So I think we will see that with most businesses, and as a result, that will, I think, lead to more flexi working in office spaces that are set up for more flexible type businesses who can come in and go out as they please. Like you look at like kind of your Regus offices or your WeWork, those sorts of places where it's kind of the facilities are provided and then it's more flexible for people to come in and out. I think we'll see more of that. So I think certainly in terms of property developers and investors, there's I think a business opportunity for some people there to kind of get into that space. But then what that will also mean is there will also still be a lot of empty stuff. Maybe some of the bigger offices will turn into smaller offices. I think obviously a lot of the high street retail will change. I mean, we're seeing that changing anyway. That was changing before COVID anyway, with the likes of Amazon. I think COVID's only kind of really accelerated that. So we'll see more retail spaces change from, shops to maybe service-based businesses like hairdressers or, coffee shops or stuff that people want to go or need to go into town for rather than do their shopping. But that will mean still just for the fact of sheer volume of spaces that are available, that there will be some empty spaces. So they'll either have to be converted into resi, or they'll be converted into these like little flexi type spaces that I've mentioned. And that obviously then creates opportunities for developers and investors to come in and do that change of use. I mean, it was interesting at the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, obviously, when he did the statement about releasing the lockdown, actually one of the media, one of the journalists asked him the question about this exactly. And, the question was, do you think that a lot of the retail will get converted into residential, and therefore will there be a relaxation in the planning as a result? And Boris was like, yeah, I expect it would happen. I mean, he still believes that the likes of London, big city centres, people will come back to work. But on the fringes in the more sort of smaller towns, we will see a lot of conversions to resi, or, like I said, service-based stuff. But there's only going to be a limit of them, we're not going to see an entire high street of hairdressers and coffee shops. Do you know what I mean? Because they're not going to survive. So,
no.
And then the older we get, the more hair we lose. Like me, I don't need a hairdresser. So, so yeah. I think there will be opportunities definitely in that space, and I think planning will change as a result to help developers make that change of use. We're already seeing a lot of permitted development rights already with over changes of use for spaces like this. So it's only going to, I think it's only going to get easier in that respect, because I think there's also a massive backlog in planning of all the stuff that hasn't been able to go through because of, planning departments have not been able to work and been on furlough. So anything to kind of ease that process, because it's quite a laborious process anyway, the planning process. So whatever they can do to kind of speed that pipeline up, they will do through adding additional permitted development rights to make it easier for people just to go, yeah, okay, change your use, or we can add this, or we can change that without having to put in a full planning act.
No, absolutely. And thinking about it, actually, we talked about it briefly in the past, but how the permitted planning changes, if you like, over the last 12 months, because there has been changes, hasn't there, with regards to permitted development, to extensions, to planning. I suppose how has that helped you? Has that impacted your business kind of in a positive way? How do you see that element working?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously whenever they bring in additional permitted development rights, it's great for a developer, because it means that as long as we know what they are, we can spot opportunities easier, right? Because we know what's able to be done without having the hurdle of planning. Because the planning hurdle is always a risk for developers, because you don't know until you've been given the big tick, right? There's ways to mitigate around it through the way that we structure offers and stuff, but to go to permitted development obviously helps. You mentioned some of the ones that they've obviously come through, like airspace development is another one which is coming through, or has been sort of last year came through as a permitted development right, being able to build up in certain scenarios and circumstances. So again, that's all adding to opportunity. The only challenge is then when it becomes is finding sites that are then commercially viable, because obviously to add like flats or levels above existing buildings, there's obviously a lot of logistical challenges to that, which then only really works in certain areas of the country where the capital values are high enough to warrant doing the work, because you're paying a certain rate per square meter to do the build. You've got to sell it for at least twice that, let's say, to cover all your costs, including whatever, and make a profit. But where the resale rates are still quite low in certain areas of the country, that doesn't make it viable. So I think that does apply to the opportunities do vary per geographical area, of course. And yeah, I mean, it's certainly the other thing though is that there's elements that's helped the business, and I think there's also elements that make it more restrictive. So, for example, HMOs, so houses of multiple occupancy, which I know you're familiar with because I've got a number of those. They brought in legislation that prevents a number of them being put into certain areas, and so there's more red tape for the developer to do that, because they want to limit and control the number of HMOs in certain areas. So they've removed permitted development rights in certain circumstances to stop people from just using that too much, if that makes sense. So there are pros and cons, and we go through cycles where there's certain strategies that are more it's just kind of like the hot strategies, because that's what permitted development rights and the opportunities are allowing for, and then that will change and another one will come in. Like, for example, service accommodation is a massive one right now, like really popular, because it wasn't obviously a year ago because there's no bookings, but people have now got bookings into 2022 already. And there's a big demand for staycations this year, of course, for obvious reasons. So the next 2 to 3 years in service accommodation is like kind of the place to be. But then it's like, well, what next? So, and when we're looking at all these things, it's always, you've got to be looking with that longer term view. I'm not really in the business of sort of doing a lot of too much short-term stuff. I like to think longer term with my strategies.
Yeah.
Because I like doing something, rinse and repeat, and kind of let it set and forget type thing. And as long as it keeps working and I've got no voids and whatever for the next 5-10 years, that's kind of what I like to do. And then I can build a big portfolio of them, so they're all paying me in 10 years, rather than then having to chop and change strategies all the time and stuff like that. Because that's more, there's more stuff to do and turn the handle and crank that way. So balance is important, of course. But yeah. So how have you sort of, obviously being around a lot of developers and investors, how are you sort of finding what other people are doing? Are people bringing in a lot more kind of certain strategy stuff, like commercial stuff? Are your commercial tenants struggling particularly?
Do you know, it's a good question, actually. So a lot of them around what we spoke earlier, so the Flexiworking, and very quickly, us as a business, there's going to be a massive element of Flexiworking for the team to come into the office as and when kind of they want to, they feel that they need that change, that change of environment. So we're very much looking on that picture as well. But with regards to other commercial tenants, I think where the government has done pretty well in providing financial support to a lot of businesses, we've not really seen too many commercial clients struggling. We are seeing a lot of conversions coming through where landlords or developers, contractors are buying these commercial properties where they're let out at the moment. So say they've got a 5-year lease to go. So they're buying it they're buying it with the commercial tenants in there, the rent's being paid, but their ultimate intention is to develop it into residential. So there's quite a bit of that we're seeing, but it's not affecting it from an insurance point of view because it's all tenanted. That effect will change once the leases have either been surrendered, paid off, finished, and then they look to develop it. So it's very much a thriving industry all round, both in construction, landlords. We haven't really seen too much of a void, if for a better word, with that. I mean, premiums are rising, and they have been for a little while, mainly because of the operating ratios, losses for insurers. So in layman terms, pre-COVID this is, so for every pound that an insurer was getting in, they were spending out £1.5. Even you can tell that that's not a business model that's sustainable. So there was going to be rate increases all along. And then with the hit of COVID, what it has done is put a strain on the insurers' investments. So whereas before insurers were making a loss, say, on property insurers, they would then make that up with investments. And where the investments were performing quite well in stocks and shares and various other aspects, in the last 12 months, those investments have just plummeted. So what that has done is then put a massive strain on insurers to have to increase rates so that they can get operating ratios into a profit. So that would be done over probably like a 2-3 year period, if not a bit longer. But where I was going to go with that is, where do you see kind of the property market going over the next 5 years?
I thought this is where you're heading with it, actually. I could sense that. And I think so because basically turn the clock back obviously a year ago, so where we sort of March time 2020, so a year ago, obviously this whole COVID thing was kicking off in terms of uncertainty, and as a result I was getting loads of people reaching out to me, what do you think is going to happen? And I think that was probably one of the biggest asked questions in the industry. It was like, what do you think is going to happen to the property market? And I know like Savills and Unite Franks of the world did a lot of research kind of looking at and trying to project what would happen. My view was always, I think it might take a short-term little blip, but it will come back in terms of property prices and in terms of obviously busyness and kind of, like you've said, it's a very busy industry as well, particularly at property at the moment. And that's because the fundamentals of property are still there. as a vehicle or as a market in its own right, the fundamentals are still there, and they're really, really strong because it's asset backed. There's more demand than there is supply, but that's usually less than asset value. So the fundamentals are still strong. So despite COVID coming along, okay, we might see a little bit of a dip, and obviously there's a big concern about a number of voids. I think the biggest risk to property investors and landlords at the moment is the lag of COVID, where people are maybe going through redundancies, losing jobs. Tenants may not see or be struggling financially just yet because of the furlough and the support, but maybe over the next, I reckon, 12, 24 months, you'll see some people start to struggle a bit more financially, where the support is taken away and taxation is going to start rising, because that's the only way that the government can claw back some of this money. So tax will rise for a number of people. There'll be a bit of a redistribution of wealth. So, the wealthier will have to end up paying higher taxes, whatever. But that will have a bit of an impact on voids. So I think for people who are running really high leveraged portfolios, slim cash flow margins and stuff, I think they're the ones that need to kind of take a step back and have a look at it from strategic perspective. But I think other than that, I think it's not going to. I don't think we're going to have too much of a big impact. I mean, construction is booming right now.
Yeah,
you can't get a tradesman for love nor money at the moment in most areas of the country, because obviously that pent up demand is there and people have got long order books. So, I mean, on that front, I think into construction, we're going to see rates rise in terms of materials costs. So that's going to have an impact dripped on through to the end user or the end client, which would be the developer. So that'll have a slight impact. But I think overall, I don't think we're going to have as big a knee-jerk type impact as we were expecting we would, because property is a very, very slow-moving market. It's kind of like the treacle in and around all the other. You mentioned other, markets with like sort of stocks and shares and equities and whatever, which are very volatile. They can move up and down, large percentages on a daily basis, whereas property is very slower moving. So I think we will see a bit of a dip in capital values over the next 2 years, or at least a stagnation. We might not get, but then we will get another. I think we'll get another kick. That's just my personal opinion. I don't have a crystal ball. If I did, I'd be a billionaire.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's my view. It basically just comes, for me, I'm looking at what the fundamentals, and the fundamentals still seem pretty strong.
No, that's really interesting. Thank you. And talking about risk, actually, we've talked in the past, and just wonder if we could touch on again. Talk to me about the biggest risks that kind of you form to you, the biggest risks that you look at when you're buying a new property.
So the biggest risks, that's a good question. So biggest risks of buying new properties, I mean, there are a lot. There are a lot to kind of be aware of and manage. And I think the biggest risk really, which I sort of say to everyone, is just making sure that the financials of whatever it is that you plan to do are strong. And that is your biggest risk, because if you don't do your correct due diligence, or you don't do your correct analysis and understand how you're going to make money from that asset, then that's probably your biggest risk. Because if you don't make enough money to what you've spent or what end up doing, then that's where you lose money, and that's where the financial strain can start to bite. If you can't get the borrowing that you want to afterwards, so that's really the biggest risk, the financial element. And therefore what goes into that, there's so many little bits that then make up that kind of that model, and we haven't got time to go through all of that today.
No, sure.
But I think certainly understanding how you're going to make the money is the most important thing. And then also, if you're buying for your own home, for example, then the question I always kind of push to people is like, okay, that's great to be buying your home, but what kind of home is it for you? Is it your forever home, or is it your stepping stone to your next home? Because there's a big difference then in terms of the way you should look at property. Because a lot of people buy property with their hearts, less with their heads, because we fall in love with the process of buying a house, right? We watch Grand Designs, we watch Homes on the Hammer, all these sorts of things that we fall in love with. But the reality is it's a financial tool. A property is an asset that should be looked at with a financial sense. So, for example, when I bought my first house to live in, it was always does this give me a stepping stone to the next house? How can I add value? How can I then, will it work financially to then enable me to go to the next level? and then the next level. And then each time I'm looking at something until I'm like, right, now we're ready to settle down in the forever home. I can afford to pay a bit more money for it, and then maybe overspend on a property. That's fine, because I'm going to stay there for the rest of my life. But if you don't think you're going to do that, you always want to be asking, how can I add up? And so the biggest risk is obviously then buying something that you can't do that and getting stuck at that next level. So that's I'd say the biggest risk. I mean, you've got obviously things like structural issues, and you've got, damp proofing and all that kind of stuff, but they're kind of small technical elements that you should be cluing yourself up onto anyway. But they're not really as generally as bad as most people believe that they are, because most of them are, you can kind of overcome them through one way or another, through negotiation, renegotiating the price, for example, or putting indemnity policies in place, doing a refurb, or whatever it may do to overcome those little technical issues. The big one is making sure you can make money and build wealth off that asset.
Okay, no, that brings me nicely onto the kind of final point, really, and the fact that you found a passion for coaching, training new property developers, looking for new people to come into the kind of development world, the landlord world. And there's lots of aspects that you do within your course on that. Would you like to just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, if I may, yeah, appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, basically, I hope maybe you've maybe worked out. I mean, you know me for years, Wes. I've got a big passion for property. I love property in terms of what you can do with it and stuff. And I've also been around the industry long enough, just going through my own kind of coaching programs and training stuff. The training industry around property is quite big now, and it's been growing at quite a big rate over the last few years. But as a result, when you get an industry that does grow quickly, you get also a lot of people who sort of try and turn a quick buck out of it. And there's also a number of sort of negative elements to that industry and some negative pressure around it stuff. So my view has always been to sort of go back to fundamentals always. And so the way that I work with, I try and work with business owners who've got some capital behind them already, because that's how we can get bigger results. But basically to help them either get started or to scale up their kind of portfolios by really kind of trying to map out what is it that you're trying to achieve. Because, I've worked with, and I've been around a number of investors before in like mastermind groups and the like, of people who have invested a lot of money into these programs without any real idea of how they want to use it and where they want to go. So I very much start with, right, what are you actually trying to achieve here? What is your end destination? And then sort of applying my engineering type process brain, which is, okay, well, let's work it back. Let's break down the numbers and kind of then create a bit of a plan that enables you to get there and gets you the results to get where you want to get, or at least a big way towards where you want to get. And then we go out and we implement. So the stuff, the kind of stuff I cover within engineering wealth is that sort of, first of all, that mapping out, understanding the process, where you A to B, where are you right now, where do you want to go, map it backwards, create a bit of a plan. And then once we've done that, there's then sort of ongoing mentorship, coaching, guidance to help you implement to get there. Because obviously as you go along, questions are going to come up, which is, okay, well, look, this has got structural issues. What do I do with it? Or who's the best person to use this and that kind of stuff. So actually, and also people are busy, right? So there's an element of accountability and also, reviewing numbers to make sure that it stacks, to make sure you don't get stuck on that next one. So that mentorship program is also really, really powerful. And the people I've been working with, they take full responsibility for their results. But, I'm quite proud to say that I'd say a good 95% of my clients have got some big tangible result as a result, because we went through that process of mapping it out, which is really important, rather than just throwing everyone in a big room, firing content at them about, something and then kind of leaving them on their own. It's more hand holding and guiding and mentorship and that kind of thing. So that's where I work my best. And that's what engineering wealth's about, really.
Excellent.
So, yeah, and I think in terms of, if people want to find out a bit more, just to go to the Engineering Wealth website, engineeringwealth.co.uk. It covers wealth as a whole, but property is obviously a very big part and big vehicle of wealth. So engineering wealth is basically about that understanding from a financial sense, without picking a particular vehicle, where is it you're trying to go, and then break down the map and create the plan. And then there's property specific then guidance of how to implement and apply it to property. So the property incubator program, for example, is taking a handful of investors over the course of a year and then helping them implement through property, get results, get the right deals, get the right teams around them, raise the right finance, work with partners, investors, raise finance where they need to do the deals that they want to do. Thanks.
Sounds really good.
Yeah, so obviously check that out and reach out if anyone would like to have a chat about it, see if it's the right thing for you, and hopefully we can kind of get you some form of tangible results going forward.
Excellent. Thanks, Tanner. Do you know what, that pretty much brings us up. Kept you long enough, so I really appreciate your time today and going through this. Is there any last words you'd like to have, or you
no, other than just to thank you again, obviously, not only just for this, but obviously for the way that you support me and obviously my business and my property journey, I suppose. You guys do a great job. And I think certainly when, people do come on my programs or listen to me on some of my sort of video content similar to this, they sort of say, one of the things I always promote to people is get yourself a good team, particularly if you are buying properties, get a good insurance broker, because you do a lot of the heavy lifting for me and I don't have to worry about it. And headspace is the most important thing when you're trying to build a business and an empire. So, get people who are good at their jobs to do it well. And I couldn't recommend you more. And obviously, I've referred you a load of people over the years. So basically, if you listen to this and you are looking for insurance, 100% pick up the phone to Wes, because it's definitely worth it. So there you go. Return the favour, mate.
Brilliant. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, mate. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the Glowshaw Business Chat series. If you'd like to be a guest on our show, or if you'd like to discuss how we can help your business mitigate the risks you face, please email Wes on wesleyhaines@glowshaw.co.uk.